If you don't like where you're heading, there's no shame in going back and changing your path.
Oh, when have you ever changed your path?
Hey everybody, and thank you for watching another video. My name is Merge, and with the series finale of Better Call Saul capping off the series, we are once again left wanting more from the Breaking Bad universe. From potential spin-offs with characters like Dr. Caldera or even the Young Lalo series, to wanting to know how characters like Skyler White and family or even the newly identified Mr. Driscoll aka Jesse Pinkman are adjusting to life post-Breaking Bad. And me personally, I think if creator Vince Gilligan wanted to, his team could expand the universe to rival any other television universe, from The Walking Dead to even Game of Thrones. And I mention those two shows in particular because they're both expanding their respective universes with spin-offs that explore different times in the universe that connect back to the original series. And so far with the Breaking Bad universe, it's been done with the movie spin-off El Camino, showing us how Jesse Pinkman was able to evade capture from the police and start over by enlisting the services of Ed the Disappearer to get a new identity in Alaska. And also the spin-off series prequel Better Call Saul, giving us both a backstory of how Jimmy McGill, Gus Fring, and Mike Ehrmantraut made the transformation to become the characters we know in Breaking Bad, and also showing us Saul's life past Breaking Bad as Omaha Cinnabon manager Gene Takovic, and ending the series with Jimmy McGill aka Saul Goodman serving an 86-year prison sentence. And with it potentially being a few years down the road before we get a new addition to the Breaking Bad universe, fingers crossed, knock on wood, all that good stuff.
You know, never say never.
I thought I entertained the idea of what the series would be like if brother to Jimmy McGill and the main antagonist for the first half of Better Call Saul, Chuck McGill, never kicked the bucket, or lantern in this case. And if you could leave a like on this video to support the channel and even consider subscribing to stay up to date with the latest content, I'd appreciate it. And without further interruption, let's get into it. Charles Lambert McGill, a once successful attorney who ran the law firm HHM with business partner and friend Howard Hamlin, but will sadly always be remembered for being a mentally unstable recluse who believes he suffers from a condition known as electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or in layman terms, being allergic to electricity. And throughout the first 3 seasons of Better Call Saul, we find out that Chuck has always had this underlying hatred for his brother for who he was and who he was trying to become, believing that he will always be the slip and fall con man that he aptly named Slippin' Jimmy. And to be fair, in Chuck's eyes, all the way up until his last days, he was not only right about Jimmy, but he died unable to prove it. But what if he did? What if during the ending of season 3 episode 10 titled Lanterns, after his EHS symptoms returned and he destroyed his entire house in an attempt to remove all the electricity, which I'm not even sure if that's even possible, but we see him sitting in the basement trying to kick off that lantern, and before the final kick, he pauses and he's given a moment of clarity, thinking of all the relationships he's ruined, from his marriage to Howard and of course his own brother Jimmy, and he decides that suicide will not be the legacy that he leaves behind. And Chuck stands up, he turns off the lantern, and he leaves his house to make a call to Dr. Cruz to see if she will see him tonight, and this will be the first steps in Chuck's official rehabilitation.
Well, would you tell her that something's come up and I'm not able to come in today?
Now, I'm not really going to break down his day-to-day because that would be a show all in itself, and honestly, we don't have time for that, but it would be a really cool connection to see that Chuck goes to the same rehab facility that Jesse went to, or even seeing a conversation between Walter White and Chuck. That would be incredible, but definitely an idea for a future video. But for now, I'll just say that Chuck never fully recovered from his condition, but he does have a better way of treating himself, allowing him to live somewhat of a normal life. And the impact this one change will have on the universe is monumental for a number of reasons, starting with Jimmy becoming Saul. Because initially, it was Chuck's death and their last conversation that pushed him into embracing that Saul Goodman persona, and with that aspect removed, I don't doubt that he would still become Saul, but just maybe in a different time frame. Because as cold as that last conversation between them was, I would still think that Jimmy would try to make amends with Chuck if he didn't die, and I think that maybe their contact would be sparse at best, but they would still talk, because let's face it, we know that Jimmy loves his brother and he would do anything for him, and no matter what Chuck puts him through, because he's put him through a lot, Jimmy would still be there for his brother. And as for Chuck, I think with his new lease on life, he would try to patch things up with Howard, and they work to dispute his malpractice insurance and have him back working at HHM once again with some serious negotiations. Like, this isn't going to be like an overnight thing, this will probably take a few months, but he would eventually become a lawyer again. But he would still have that burning desire to expose Jimmy for what he is to the lawyer community, and this time Chuck would be just as resourceful and cunning as Jimmy, just waiting for the best time to strike, and he waits all the way up until season 6, around the same time that Kim and Jimmy decide to destroy Howard. And I know there's a lot of hoops and loops and logistics to go through to get to that point, especially with Chuck being alive, but for the sake of this video, let's just say around that same time Chuck has gone out of town to undergo some rehab treatment for his EHS condition, like a yearly oil change, metaphorically speaking. Very similar to Walter White, but in Walter's case where he was just using it as an excuse, Chuck is actually going through with the program. And maybe during the mediation of the Sandpiper case, Chuck was on the phone listening to Howard's meltdown, but he chose not to intervene because he is fully aware that this is Jimmy's doing, and he wanted Howard to know what it felt like when he had his meltdown on the stand.
He defecated through a sunroof.
Julie, you got the wrong envelope.
That was the only one on your desk.
Look again.
Are you all right? Your eyes.
I'm fine.
And shortly after the meeting, but before his arrival at Kim and Jimmy's apartment, Chuck and Howard would have a conversation about the settlement failure and his reputation, and they would devise a plan to have Howard come to Jimmy's apartment, and Chuck would listen and record the conversation and with the same tape recorder to get any information they can use against him, because it just worked out so well the last time the conversation was recorded.
Jimmy!
You take me!
And when Howard arrives at Kim and Jimmy's apartment, things play out the same way with him getting shot in the head by Lalo, but in this situation with Chuck listening to the encounter after the gunshot, the phone hangs up as Howard's body hits the floor, and Chuck is just confused at what he just heard. And he attempts to call back Howard a few times, but he gets no answer, and he even considers calling Jimmy, but he chooses against it. And Chuck just plays back the recording over and over and transcribing the conversation himself, and when he's finished listening, he comes to the conclusion that Howard might have just been killed. And an even more frightening revelation is, who did Jimmy get involved with, Chuck thinks to himself. Because the last conversation that Chuck and Saul had, Chuck mentioned that there were whispers of Saul representing cartel members, but Saul denied it, and he deflects by asking Chuck, "Remember when you told me that I never really mattered that much to you?" "Well, if that's the case, then what does it matter what I do right now?" Saul says. And that denial from that conversation was enough for Chuck to connect the dots that Jimmy was involved with some kind of cartel business, and maybe Howard got in the way. But at this point, Chuck cannot be too sure, as it's barely morning, and Chuck is miles away at the rehab facility, so he spends the entire next day calling around for Howard, and all attempts are unsuccessful, from him reaching out to his ex-wife Cheryl to even Cliff Maine. No one has seen or heard anything from Howard all day. And Chuck, growing desperate, he then reaches out to Jimmy and asks if he's seen Howard, and Jimmy just deflects by asking why would he even know where Howard is. And Chuck asks if Howard stopped by his house last night to drop off that celebratory bottle of wine from the Sandpiper settlement, and Jimmy says, oh yeah, right. Yeah, he did come over last night, and he was talking crazy and blaming me and Kim for something. Honestly, Chuck, I think Howard may have a substance abuse problem. Didn't you hear what happened to him at the mediation? Chuck is slow to respond, knowing what he knows, and he just says, yes, I heard what happened to him, and I just wanted to check in on him, but I'm having a hard time reaching him for some reason.
Really, no need to.
And at that moment, Saul goes completely quiet on the line for a few seconds, and Chuck, he breaks the silence by changing the subject and inviting Jimmy over for dinner when he returns from his treatment. Saul accepts, and he tells Chuck he'll pass along the message, and at that point, Chuck knows that Jimmy's lying, but he just chooses to bite his tongue. And the call ends, and for the remainder of Chuck's time at the treatment center, he plans for the possibility that his own brother may be involved with murderers, and those same murderers could be responsible for Howard's death. And if that's the case, he needs to be brought to justice, and who better to bring down Saul Goodman than his own brother? And seeing that he already did it once, it shouldn't be that hard, right? Well, yeah, about that. So what Chuck doesn't know is that Mike and Gus had tracked down the last call that Howard made and is fully aware about Chuck, so much so that they have guys watching the treatment center and have the phone tapped, so they know that Chuck didn't talk. Yet. But to ensure that, Mike stages for Chuck to be picked up by his men, and Chuck is forced to put a bag on his head, and when he gets in the car, the entire time he's telling him that you have the wrong guy, and he doesn't know what this is about, and after a few moments he's pulled out of the car and onto the desert sand with the bag still on his head. And unknown to Chuck, Gus and Mike are standing right in front of him. The two deadliest people in the entire Breaking Bad universe are right in front of this man, and he has no idea. And Mike just tells Chuck, "I know you were listening on the phone with an associate of yours the other night, and something abrupt happened, and given your expertise in your field, you likely discovered the truth. But now you have a decision to make, Mr. McGill. You can choose to report your suspicions to the authorities and risk you and your brother's safety, all for the sake of justice, and being that you're right now in the middle of a desert, it's not that hard to make you disappear. And your other option is simply just to look the other way." And Chuck, he just sits there breathing heavily, and you can tell he is scared out of his mind because he is not saying a word. He is literally shaking right now. And Mike, he continues saying, "Now you can consider this your first and final warning, and regardless of your decision, we will know and act accordingly. I hope we have an understanding, and hopefully we don't have to be in touch," Mike says as him and Gus leave the scene. And Chuck, he is still bound with a bag on his face, and he gets put in the car and he's dropped off at his house. When the bag is finally taken off, he's literally tossed out the car like Wendy style. A few days pass and Howard's car is found on the beach, very similar to the original, filled with drug paraphernalia, and his death is ruled as a suicide and currently unable to recover the body. And we pick up with Chuck leading the memorial procession at HHM, and you can really tell that he's really broken up about Howard, especially seeing how it was Chuck's idea for Howard to come to Kim and Jimmy's apartment that night, but he keeps that little detail to himself. And while he's conversing with Howard's ex-wife Cheryl, they're interrupted by Kim and Saul, who offer their condolences, and just like the original, Cheryl grills Saul about the last time that they've seen Howard, and Chuck takes the place of Cliff Maine by saying the conversation is not appropriate at this time. And when Cheryl walks away after Kim shares the story of seeing Howard snorting something, Jimmy brings up the dinner offer that Chuck extended to him a few days back, and Chuck does a rain check mainly out of fear of Jimmy's mysterious associates, and he also says that he has to work double duty at the firm now that Howard's gone. And Saul has a quick heart-to-heart with Chuck and tells him that if he ever wants to talk, he's right here. And Chuck just looks at Saul with sadness in his eyes and says, "Same here. But you just take care of yourself, okay, Jimmy? As Chuck walks away to mingle with others in the area. As the time passes, Chuck hears about Kim and Jimmy's separation, and as much as Chuck wants to reach out to his brother, he was genuinely scared because of those who threatened him. And at the same time, his EHS symptoms are flaring up, causing him to take some time off of work. And ultimately, Chuck ends up housebound again, and he's forced to enlist the help of Saul. And after what seems like years, Jimmy and Chuck are back in the same house, back to their old routine. And once that ice has been poured in the cooler, Chuck just outright and seemingly out of the blue, in a calm demeanor, "Jimmy, look at me. Did one of your cartel clients kill Howard?" And at that moment, Saul's heart sank as he's frozen with fear, looking at Chuck awaiting an answer. What? What do you mean, Chuck? Saul stutters. "Didn't the police already rule his death a suicide? So why would I know anything different?" Saul says as he is clearly nervous, but he tries to play it off. But this is his brother Chuck he's talking about. He can just see right through that. And Chuck just stares at Jimmy in a moment of silence, then hands him the transcribed message along with the tape recording and says, "Jimmy, I know the truth. It's all right here. Howard, you, Kim, and I'm guessing your cartel client, the only reason I didn't come to you sooner was because I was hogtied in the desert and I had a bag on my face, and someone told me that if I said anything, I would be putting you in danger as well as myself. And if you're in too deep with these individuals, Jimmy, you need to let me know and we can handle this the right way, by the book, together." And Saul tries to deny any involvement he has with the cartel, and Chuck grows annoyed with his lies, and he just tells him to take the file, do with it as you want, because I just want you to know that I know. And whenever you want to talk about it, I'm right here. And Saul takes the file and he leaves. Back at Saul's office, he's listening to the recordings and reading the transcripts, and he doesn't know what to do at this point. He knows that Chuck knows, and likely he's made copies of his evidence because, let's face it, that's Chuck. But Saul doesn't really have a person to go to about this information. But then Saul thinks to himself, since Chuck hasn't gone to the police by now, he would think he's in the clear, but this is Chuck we're talking about, so there must be some kind of plan or endgame that he has. And Saul debates about reaching out to Mike about this issue, but he decides against it, not wanting to complicate an already complicated situation. So Jimmy keeps his information to himself and chooses to distance himself from Chuck by just hiring someone to bring him supplies from now on. Because to Saul, let's just say that night has already been compartmentalized, and he is too busy keeping himself busy to think about all the trauma in his life, from Howard's death, which is his fault, to Kim leaving, also his fault, and now Chuck coming at him with this recording. He just chooses not to deal with any of it and instead just continues to being Saul, and if this moment was to come up again, he would deal with it then. So this would be tomorrow's problem in his eyes. As the years pass, Chuck's condition worsens to the point where he has to step down from HHM, and he's heard the news of his brother's involvement with drug kingpin Walter White, which makes him even more hesitant of coming to the police with his evidence. Because he's seen the trail of bodies left in their wake from lawyers to neo-Nazis and even DEA agents, and with Saul being on the run, Chuck is just worried for his brother. But a few months later, he gets the news from Bill Oakley that says that Saul has been caught by the police and he's being extradited to New Mexico. Now, I know I'm clearly jumping over some plot points, but the important thing to know at this point is that Saul has been caught like the original, but unlike the original, Kim is coming to make her confession right now, and she just so happens to run into Chuck at the courthouse with his space blanket suit on. And they have a moment with each other telling everything that they know about what's going on, and Chuck suggests that he and Kimmy work together to bring Jimmy to justice to put this nightmare behind him so that way he won't weasel out of anything this time. And Kim, she declines, not wanting to move against Jimmy, only wanting for her side of the story to be told, and whatever happens after that would be justice. Chuck understands her point of view and wishes her the best on her endeavors, but for Chuck, it's all about the court seeing Jimmy for who he is, because he has not forgotten the day at the courtroom during the episode Chicanery.
Not our Jimmy. Couldn't be precious Jimmy.
So on that fateful day, in black and white, Saul Goodman is on trial, and within the courtroom sits everyone from the original, from Blanca to Marie to Kim to the DEA agent, the lawyer, Bill Oakley. And while Saul is about to take the stand, he hears the door open and in steps his brother Chuck. And when Chuck comes in, he sits right next to Kim. Jimmy looks back for a moment looking at Chuck, but then he continues to speak. And Chuck is waiting for the opportune moment to eject, but as he listens to his brother's words, he hears him lay out the truth, and it surprises him. And so much so he begins to tear up, because for the first time in years, Chuck is actually proud of Jimmy for owning up to his wrongdoings. And when Howard's death is mentioned, Chuck just bows his head as Jimmy takes full responsibility for that as well, again surprising Chuck. And then he looks back and tells him, "You don't have to worry anymore. Now go ahead and live your life, Chuck." And at that moment, Chuck has a feeling of peace and calm, a feeling that he hasn't felt for almost a decade, and like a switch, his EHS symptoms have just instantly been turned off, kind of like this.
It's so quiet.
And in the end, Jimmy would still be serving an 86-year sentence, and during that last scene, maybe Chuck would agree to continue visiting him in prison. Kind of like a favor for Jimmy being there for him during his space banking phase. And as the years passed, the two would bond, truly becoming brothers again. And even though Saul Goodman lost the game, Jimmy McGill won because he got his brother back. And in the end, in the words of Hector Salamanca,
La familia es todo.
Hey guys, I want to thank you so much for watching this video. I truly enjoy making these what if videos, and I know on the grand scheme of things, this one really didn't change much in the universe, but it did offer a unique perspective and another layer into the McGill family dynamic. But if you think that this video was just a waste of time because it really didn't add much to the universe, I'd say, what if it did? But anyways, I want to hear from you guys. What kind of impact do you think that Chuck would have on the Breaking Bad universe if he did survive the series? Whatever it is, comment down below, let me know, and I'll do my best to respond. Until then, my name is Merge. Later.